So, this will be a Draw My Lifestyle narrative about what it was like living during the Industrial Revolution, specifically during our time period today from 1783 to 1815. Okay, so starting from childhood, the lives of children were difficult during this period because of the factories and because of urbanization. Children were being born and growing up in these growing cities, and so they would start working between 5 and 7 years old. So these buildings made up a lot of the cities, and they had several homes in them. And one of the reasons, or a few of the reasons, that kids were so useful in factories is that they were smaller, so they could get around the machinery better. Their employers could pay them less than they would adults, and their fingers were very nimble. And so some of the most popular factories around this time were textile factories, especially at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And something important to note is that child labor was not a new thing during the Industrial Revolution. It was just children would start working younger than they would during agriculture, like during the agricultural times. So this is what a textile factory would look like, and those are the spools of wool, and they were basically just long rows of these machines, and the workers would have to work with the wool. And something important, children made up 2/3 of the workers in these factories. And then that's just showing how dark and sad factory life was. And here is a mean factory owner yelling at the workers. Another thing that happened during this time was that infant mortality rate went down. So before, little kids like this young girl would rarely live past the age of 5. After the Industrial Revolution began, infant mortality rates decreased, meaning kids would live to be older than 5, which is what was considered infancy. But even so, childhood mortality was still rampant, so it was not common that, children would live past childhood into adulthood. So children were still dying, but not at infancy. So something else was important was that school was not yet compulsory at this time, compulsory, free, or universal. So kids really didn't have a choice but to work because it's not like they had school to take up their time. So one of the biggest cities that emerged was called Cottonopolis. It was Manchester, but it was called Cottonopolis because most of the factories were textile factories, which was really common around this time. And so when you look at pictures of Manchester in this time period, you see a lot of these longish buildings that I mentioned earlier, which have several houses in each of them, and then obviously the factories. And then, of course, in addition to the nicer looking houses from some parts of the city, a lot of people were living in poverty in these slum areas. So even between houses and between buildings and alleyways, people would live here, and trash would pile up and everything was really unhygienic, and there would be a lot of kids living in poverty, usually a mother with lots of kids living in poverty and hungry. And
houses that would
they would live in these kind of
cardboard,
ramshackle houses made from cardboard or scrap metal. A lot of times the floors were just dirt, and there's some rain because their lives were pretty sad. And they were always cold.
And all the meanwhile,
the mom's holding a baby because they had a lot of babies around this time. And then obviously the factories in the background as always. So obviously not all cities were terrible like Manchester. London and Edinburgh were some of the more important, kind of more developed cities with financial centers like banks and government centers and government buildings and things like that. The city looked a lot nicer. They had nicer buildings and roads, and they were generally more home to more upscale people. There was an emerging middle class, which I'll discuss in a bit, and so there were a lot of horse-drawn carriages people would use to get around, and lots of happier people in the streets because they had more money and they were working in places like the bank. So going back to the middle class I mentioned earlier, there were a lot more of especially men working in things like banks and other financial institutions, working in businesses. And so, here's this happy man with his briefcase and his hat, and another one happy because they have more money than factory workers and they're going to their jobs at the bank. A problem that emerged for people, especially in London, was air pollution, which came not just from the factories, but also it was basically the source was coal burning, and that included factories, but also railroads. So since transportation and like steam power were growing, so were railroads. So the railroads are, the trains are going choo choo, but they're releasing all of this gas that is polluting the air. So that made the air quality in London really bad, even if it wasn't as industrial of a city as other cities like Manchester. And so going back to Cottonopolis, aka Manchester, one of the big problems was a lack of infrastructure, and that especially had to do with like waste and sewage and how that impacted hygiene. So there were a lot of instances where people would just throw their waste out their windows into rivers, making these green rivers because they were so dirty and infected, and this led to a lot of hygiene problems and illnesses like cholera. Okay, so now we're going to talk about women. So there are a few theories about women during the Industrial Revolution. One of the theories holds that during the more agricultural times in rural areas, women had an important role in the household because they had a big part in planting and harvesting crops, and so they actually had like a role comparable to men during this time, pre-revolution. And then once the Industrial Revolution took place, there's a theory that says women were kind of relegated to being back in the household and being housewives, while the men went off to work either in factories for working class families or in banks for middle class families. There's another theory that says that it was more like, there's the man going off to the factory. So there are other theories that say that it was more like the factories actually gave women the opportunity to work as much as working in agriculture, because the entire family was really needed as workers, and their wages were needed because wages were a bit lower. So the whole family is going off to the factory here and bringing the money back home. And then the theory continues to say that that was kind of a second stage, the first stage being like the agricultural times. And then this third stage turns into the family kind of raising their quality of life a little bit as the three of them earn wages to bring back home. And then the women advancing to white-collar jobs, like being clerks or working at stores or secretaries, and which actually showed an advancement for women and almost a bit of empowerment. Okay, so since industrialization arguably brought about a higher quality of life, and people were able to spend more money on consumer goods, things like flatware and china became more popular. Sugar, which was a luxury, was now becoming a bit more common, as were coffee and tea. That's the sugar is in that little bowl, and coffee or tea could be in those little cups. And another thing was clothing. So it was being produced more widely. People were having to make it less at home, and so that was being more common for families to buy. Another important development of this time was an increasing literacy rate. So that ugly-looking set of circles is my interpretation of a paper machine. And so since the paper machine was invented, paper became easier to distribute, and so people were reading more newspapers, more novels, and eventually, not exactly in our time period, a little bit after, books called Penny Dreadfuls became a thing, where they were like kind of mass-produced
low quality stories that people really liked. And along with literacy came political activism. So people started getting more involved in politics because they were more informed. And so here we have some protesters. It didn't necessarily lead to protesting, but it did lead to just people being more active.
Okay, so speaking of literacy and political activism, another thing that grew during this time were workers' unions. I guess because it's easier to organize when you're all working in a factory. So the workers would get together and demand better conditions, and a lot of times would go on strike. And obviously, going on strike, everybody's upset, the workers are upset, and so are the factory owners. And so they worked to outlaw unions, and they were outlawed for a bit, and in the 1820s, even when they were no longer illegal, they were still really repressed. So here's the angry factory owner because he doesn't have any workers, and the unions getting heavily repressed. So another development during this time was the group called the Luddites, and these were a lot of times artisans, like weavers, whose jobs had been taken by the factories, and so they would get together and kind of mob factories and destroy them, set them on fire, destroy the machinery, to kind of protest their jobs being taken away by industrialization. And when they were caught, the government would hang them as an example to other Luddites.
So, believe it or not, I have actually drawn the life of a person during this time, because life expectancy in the year 1800 was only 40 years. So basically, you start working when you are around 6, and you work until you die, sadly. Thank you for watching.